The utter strangeness of all this for the vast majority of people in the Roman world did not lie in the notion that a mortal might become divine. The border between the heavenly and the earthly was widely held to be permeable. Divinity was for the greatest of the great, for the victors and the heroes and the kings. Its measure was the power to torture one's enemies, not to suffer it oneself, to nail them to the rocks of a mountain or turn them into spiders or blind and crucify them after conquering the world. That a man who had himself been crucified might be hailed as a god could not help but be seen by people everywhere across the Roman world as scandalous, obscene, grotesque. This is from the preface of Tom Holland's great, great book, Dominion, describing the scandal of belief that Jesus, who was crucified by the Roman state, could then ascend to be a god. And not just that, as his followers proclaimed, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We're back in our part two of Rome in our Empire series. And that is really the situation where we left things. Jesus has been crucified. His followers are claiming he's risen from the dead. He is proclaiming himself, and his followers are proclaiming him to be the Son of God, the King of the Jews. But there already is a Son of God and a King of the Jews. And so from the very beginning of the Christian church, you have these competing claims over who Jesus is and what his claims mean for the political and geopolitical world around him.
Exactly. We left off last time with the reign of Augustus, the first real emperor of Rome. He died in 14 AD, and Tiberius was his successor. Tiberius reigned from 14 AD until 38 AD, but he withdrew from life in Rome and would have barely noticed, if at all, about the crucifixion of a proposed king and lord of the universe in a corner of the empire known as Judea. But the claims that were made for Jesus were offensive to the Romans, that he might be the Lord of all, and offensive to Herod, that he might be the king of the Jews. And as Tom Holland so eloquently noted, the fact that he ended up being crucified would have just been so discordant with his claims. It would have been an upside down moment for them.
Yeah, what's interesting about the whole crucifixion thing is how common it was in the Roman Empire, especially after
Mm-hmm.
Christ is going to get even more common among Christians that Rome is trying to suppress, but that it also wasn't something that was talked about in any kind of polite company.
Polite
And so,
society, yeah.
Holland points out that it's not surprising that we have very few accounts of what crucifixion was actually like. It's not something that you would really write down or talk about, even though everybody knew it. The surprising thing is that we actually have any accounts of somebody being crucified.
Right.
And the most detailed accounts that we have are actually four accounts, some of whom were eyewitnesses, some of whom were interviewing eyewitnesses, which we know today as the four Gospels. These are the most detailed accounts of crucifixion in the ancient world. They are spotlighting the person who was crucified in a way that certainly isn't seen anywhere else in the ancient world. And it
Right.
brings the question of Christianity and Rome, understanding the Roman Empire and its relation to Christianity, really does start around this question of what does it mean for someone to be crucified and then claim to be a god, claim to be the Son of God. And the early part of the church is deriving its existence, its morals, its reason for being from Christ's own death and resurrection. So, the teaching of the New Testament is that Christians are going to be little Christs. That's why they were called Christians in the first place. And so there's an expectation that Christians will actually live like their Savior did. And this is such an upside down, radical way of viewing life, as opposed to the way the Romans viewed life, that the church from the very beginning was completely at odds with the world around them. And this presents a really fascinating question of how did the church, over 350 years, become such a force in the Roman Empire that the emperor himself converts, Constantine, in the early fourth century. And part of the answer to that question is what happens to a group of people when they have something to live for that's even more important than their earthly life. We take it for granted now that you're kind of living for eternity. We talk about this, but that just proves the Christianization of our world. The greatest power that Rome had was killing its opponents. And if you did that publicly enough, you could make sure that nobody else rebelled against you. But what happens when you have a
Hmm.
group of people to which crucifixion, death, torture, martyrdom is no longer a deterrent? And that really is the question of that you have to ask to explain the early churches. Rome's greatest weapon has now been disarmed. Their greatest weapon is death, and Christians are willing to die for what they believe in. When you take that mechanism of power away, what happens?
Yeah, it's really interesting because if you think about it, Rome at this time could not have been conquered by its own tools, and that is the military, the dealing of death. There were plenty of people that wanted to use the same tools and wanted to conquer Rome, and Rome would eventually be conquered, and they would eventually become weak militarily. But at this point in time, under Tiberius and the succeeding emperors, there was no one as good at killing as Rome. And the irony is that their kryptonite, if you will, what it was that disarmed their superpower of being able to kill people were not people who were fanatically willing to kill Romans. They were people who were willing to die for what they believed. And that's an upside down version of history. Everything about this is Rome is confronted with almost the anti-Rome.
Yeah, that's true. The power of Rome, the might of Rome, its military prowess is in turn the thing that ends up undoing it. So if you think about this
Right.
from a religious standpoint, it's obvious as you see the rise of Christianity that, like you said, they're an anti-Rome. They actually triumph not by might, but by dying for what they believe. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, the church fathers wrote. But the other thing that starts to change in Rome, and as we get into the real history of Rome through the emperors and what's going on actually at the center of the empire, is they're overextended. And so what
Mm-hmm.
happens is they're so good at conquering, they're so good at military exploits that they get an empire that they really can't manage. And so, it takes a couple hundred years, but the fruit of that is you're not able to keep a cohesive empire running unless you're continuously conquering. But once you've conquered pretty much the whole known world, then what are you supposed to do with all the spoils, with all the troops, with all the conquered peoples? And this becomes a very difficult question for the Roman emperors to deal with.
That's a really good observation, Cole. It's almost like a Ponzi scheme in the sense that in order to fund your armies, you need to conquer new territories and basically take treasure from them. But once you've conquered them, you now have to control them or pacify them. And to have the money for the soldiers to do that, you need to conquer more territory. And as you
Mm-hmm.
said, when you get to the limits of what you can effectively conquer, your Ponzi scheme collapses. And honestly, fundamentally, that's what happens with the Roman Empire is economics catch up with them.
Yes.
There is some decay, moral decay, and ideological decay, but fundamentally, their problems turn from military problems to financial problems, and they're not as good as solving the financial problems.
It's one of the few empires that truly is conquered from the inside, both
Hmm.
from a people standpoint, from an ideological standpoint, from an economic standpoint. But of course, at our point in the story, we're not worried about decay and decline. We are still on the way up because during the reign of Augustus, you get the first of two really golden ages of Rome. Augustus has a nice long reign going into the time of Tiberius. Things are really, really looking good. But they seem to have some trouble finding quality emperors after that.
They really do. They go through a stretch, and Tiberius is credited with starting this little stretch of decadence, partly because he was a reluctant emperor. He really didn't, he enjoyed being a commander, but he didn't particularly enjoy ruling and the complexity that came with that. And so he withdrew from Rome and kind of ruled from a vacation home, if you will. Had to put down a couple of rebellions. People thought, well, if you're not here, I think I'll take the throne. And he was successful at that. But at the end, he he ended up being killed, and a strange emperor, a sickness, if you will, comes into the empire. There is Caligula rules for 4 years. Caligula is by any stretch of the imagination certifiably crazy and completely powerful. The legions loved him because from a little boy he would hang out with the legions, and they called him Little Boots, and he had a little legionary uh, uniform when he was young, and they loved him. And so the Praetorian Guard effectively put him on the throne. But Cole, he was so crazy, they ended up killing him 4 years later.
Yeah, this becomes a problem in the Roman Empire. You know that you got that phrase, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What about when you get power and you already are corrupted absolutely? Because
Corrupt,
that's really
right?
the case for these guys, Claudius, Caligula, even Nero to a certain extent. So talk a little bit about how succession was done, and how you could get the greatest empire the world has ever seen ruled by these madmen.
That's a really good point because nominally it was a succession of heirs who were your children, so to speak. With the Romans, it didn't work quite that way. If you remember, Julius Caesar had several children with several different women, but he ended up adopting Octavian, who was his nephew, who had good Roman credentials, adopted him as his child and heir. You see the same thing with Augustus and Tiberius. Tiberius had good Roman credentials. You know, his parents were Roman citizens, they were highborn. And so he was the adoptive heir of Augustus. Well, when you start to stay in the family, you end up running out of, because the family's killing each other and vying for power, you end up running out of really quality people to become the heirs. And so the military steps in. For example, with Caligula, Caligula was had the credentials of birth and he was related, but the Praetorian Guard realized at some point this is crazy. We can't tolerate this. And so they take power into their hands. And honestly, for the next couple of 100 years, you're going to see the army very, very involved in succession. And at first, it's the dynasties, the relationships. You get the Julius Caesar, so you get the Julian dynasty. And now with Tiberius, you get the Julio Claudian dynasty. Those are two families, and those families rule. But more and more, we're going to see the military step in when the rulers are not really capable.
Yeah, I think one of the lessons from this Empire series is, first of all, armies are not that great at picking emperors. This
True.
usually does not go that well. However, in almost every empire, success as a general is going to lead to success as a or at least accession as an emperor. And that's certainly the way the pattern that the Romans follow. Past the point of where we're going to talk about, all through the Roman Empire until it declines and falls, really powerful military leaders are going to
Right.
become emperor. Same is true, actually, in our not too distant past. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower being president is because he was such an accomplished military leader. I mean, this is just a fact of
Good
leadership.
point.
The problem after you get past Augustus and Tiberius is that these people come to the throne partially because of their accomplishments, but partially because of the machinations that go on within Rome itself. I mean, this is where things really start to turn into a soap opera. In fact, if you read Suetonius, you feel like you're watching a soap opera,
That's exactly
because these
right.
people have the craziest lives. So, there's a lot of the things that we think about with these Roman emperors, trying to make their horses senators, things like that,
Yeah.
killing each other, all of that kind of stuff. Um, but the one that probably has the biggest impact on our biblical story is a couple of emperors later, and that would be one of the most famous emperors for all the wrong reasons, the Emperor Nero.
Exactly. So after Caligula, you raised a good point. Let me trace this quickly. You need respectability, and that is you need to be from a highborn family. You need to follow the system. So you need to have the credentials, but you also actually need to be a good commander and have the respect of the legions. Well, after Caligula, Claudius becomes emperor, and Claudius, reigns from 41 to 54. Claudius has the respectability, but he is a weak individual. He's got some physical limitations. He's not a warrior. And consequently, he gets engulfed in intrigue. And so at the end of his reign, he's had several wives, and he makes the mistake of marrying a girl named Agrippina. And she has a son named Nero, and it's not Claudius's son. Claudius does have a son named Britannia, but you begin to see that the respectability doesn't help you if you don't have the army. And so the story goes that Agrippina politically maneuvers her son Nero to become the next emperor. And there's an interesting story as to how she does that.
Yeah, so this is the high drama that you expect surrounding Nero. So yeah, he's got this very conniving mother, Agrippina. His father dies. She marries her uncle, who's the Emperor Claudius, persuades him to adopt Nero as his heir, uh, superseding his own son, Britannicus, as you mentioned. She works out a way for Nero to marry Claudius's daughter through another marriage, Octavia. These people were not they were not deterred by in-law family relationships.
Right.
So then she's believed to have poisoned Claudius when the time was right so that Nero could take the throne from him. And so in 54, the Praetorian Guard, who become kind of the kingmakers, this is the emperor's personal army, they essentially, under Agrippina's urging, make Nero the emperor. And he's only 17 at the time, which is pretty young, but as you'll see, he's fully formed in his crazy ideas of himself and his grand illusions of his reign. Most of the stories about Nero are things like, him putting on these grand musical performances where he would play the fiddle. He barely knew how to play the instrument, but if you got up, he'd have you executed. And people would basically sit there for hours and hours and hours and listen to him, even though he's not a good musician. But he thought he was great, and that's kind of how he rules. The office goes to his head almost immediately. He's brash, he's angry, he throws tantrums, and he turns out to be a great menace to the Christian church.
Indeed, he does, because he gets himself into some trouble with the Roman people, as you can imagine. But in particular, he has a grand desire to make Rome a great city. As we talked in our last episode, Augustus said that he found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble. Well, Nero decided he was going to take it to the next level. And so he wanted to get rid of the unsightly slums. The problem is the slums were inhabited by Roman citizens. Well, whether he ordered it done or some of his overzealous henchmen did it, they set fire to the slums, and a lot of Roman citizens were killed. Well, immediately, the press gets wind of this and decides that, you know what, I think Nero did this. And Nero, sensing a political disaster, decides that he needs to find some scapegoats. And Tacitus, the Roman historian, writes about this, and he's not fooled. And it turns out probably no one was fooled, but he blamed the Christians. The Christians were already poorly thought of by the Romans. Remember what we talked about. They are following a guy who was killed by being crucified, and they were not did not fit the Roman model of what a strong religion would look like. And so he blamed the Christians for it. And when the people didn't believe that it was the Christians, they didn't like the Christians, but they didn't believe it, he doubled down, and he became so cruel that it actually backfired on him. Tacitus writes about how Nero looked around for a scapegoat and inflicted the most fiendish tortures on a group of people already hated for their crimes. This was the sect known as Christians. Their founder, one Christ, had been put to death by Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. He talked about how Nero would crucify Christians by the thousands, how he would coat them in pitch and light them on fire, thinking to deflect attention from him to the Christians. But the Romans themselves, and they were no strangers to bloodshed and cruelty, it even exceeded their capacity for cruelty. And Nero ends up being called an enemy of the Roman people and kills himself. He flees and kills himself, commits suicide in 68 AD. So he did a lot of harm to the Christians, but it ended up not saving his own skin.
Yeah, the cruelty of Nero is hard for us to even wrap our minds around. One of the famous things about him with respect to the Christians is that he would light Christians on fire and use them as lamps in his gardens. I mean,
Right.
this guy is insane. This guy is just absolutely crazy. He'd cover them with wax and skins, let dogs tear them apart. And yet, you see this refrain in the book of Acts. So Acts is mostly focused on the persecution that comes from the Jews, actually, towards the
Mm-hmm.
Christians. But you see that the refrain of the book of Acts, whether it's Roman, Jewish, any other kind of persecution, is they were persecuted, they were beaten, they were left for dead, they were imprisoned, and the church grew and they were filled with joy in the Holy Spirit. And this
Right.
is this theme of the more that people try to stamp out Christians, the more they actually put fuel on the fire because people see that what these Christians are willing to die for is really true. And so Nero is an interesting intersection with the story because most of the New Testament is leading up to right about the time of Nero's life and death for two
Mm-hmm.
reasons. The first is this is the time when Paul and Peter are traditionally said to have died, is late in the reign of Nero. Of course, Peter, we don't have many details other than tradition where it says that he was taken to Rome, he was crucified, and he chose to be crucified upside down because he wasn't worthy to be crucified like Christ. Paul, we get a little bit more information in the New Testament at the end of the book of Acts. He's in Rome. He's under house arrest at that point, probably not right before he dies, which we've talked about in our Acts and First and Second Timothy episodes of our Bible book overviews. But at some point, he either leaves and then gets rearrested and comes back, or some people think he's arrested that whole time and gets progressively worse. He appeals to Caesar. That's how he gets to Rome. He has a hearing. He's sentenced to death, and his head is chopped off because he's a Roman citizen. And this is during the reign of Nero. This is during the time of intense persecution of Christians in Rome. And this is part of the end of that first generation of Christians that are the
Mm-hmm.
apostles. So we know that John lives longer than this, but really the end of the age of the apostles, the first generation of the church, comes at the end of Nero's reign. The second thing is after Nero dies, it throws the empire into chaos. And
Right.
one of the things that's happening that is so chaotic is the Jewish revolt in Jerusalem. And so shortly after Nero dies, you have this giant revolt. You have several years of fighting, guerrilla warfare, and
Mm-hmm.
you've got Roman generals, the Roman general Vespasian, who comes to Jerusalem to besiege the town. And that's when you're going to have the destruction in 70 AD by Vespasian's son Titus of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. A lot of the apocalyptic language in the New Testament is pointing towards this moment
Right.
where Jesus has risen, the church has started, and now the old era is being destroyed. That kind of cataclysmic language of the New Testament that describes the destruction of the temple. This is all happening within 4 or 5 years of Nero's death and kind of a new era of what the Christian and Roman Empire is going to look like. More antagonistic, certainly with the destruction of Jerusalem, more decentralized. There are churches now planted all over the empire. The church is growing, it's suffering, and you get what we refer now to as the early church fathers. These are the disciples of the disciples and the apostles who are trying to formulate doctrine. They're writing letters just like the apostles did. They are sorting out heresy. They're arguing with philosophers. You're starting to see the Christian church take on a life of its own. And certainly post Nero, things are going to get better for a little bit and then worse again for Christians as you lead up to a lot more persecution at the end of the first century.
Yeah, there's interesting flow to that. When Nero dies, he You get this political instability, and all of a sudden you start getting generals. Now it's just sheer power. And so you have four emperors in the year 69 AD. And the fourth one is Vespasian, and he consolidates power. His son Titus stays behind, destroys the temple in Jerusalem. Vespasian rules, then his son Titus rules. And you see a succession of generals, people that have the army behind them. Another thread that run through this, Cole, we haven't talked too much about. When we talked about Augustus, we talked about that title. His name was Octavian, but the Senate voted him the title Augustus, which had a little tinge of divinity to it. And Augustus deified Julius Caesar, meaning when he was emperor, Julius Caesar died, he passed a decree that said Julius Caesar became a god. And so we're going to do certain worshipful rites to Julius Caesar. And then, of course, Augustus was deified. Claudius, when he died, Nero deified him. And what that means is he was added to the pantheon of Roman gods, and Romans were supposed to worship him and do certain civic and public rites. Well, as time goes on, towards the end of the first century, we're going to get to Domitian. And by the time of Domitian, an emperor at the end of the first century, they're not waiting until they're dead to be deified. Domitian wants to be called Lord and God, was his title. And so throughout the empire, it's not just a matter of let's all go make an offering to the deified Julius Caesar. It's no, let's go make an offering to the living emperor as our savior and one of our gods. And this then triggers the second round of persecution of the Christians. The first was just Nero looking for a scapegoat. The second is the ego and the deification of the Roman emperors. The problem is, and particularly in Asia, which is Turkey to us now, there was the cult of the emperor, emperor worship. And they basically said, yes, Domitian, you are a god, and we're going to have some temples, and we're going to worship you, and that's good civic duty. And therein comes the second round of persecution because Christians wouldn't do that.
This is another interesting juncture for the church. And we've talked about this in our Revelation episodes. There's kind of two schools of thought on Revelation. I'd say the less popular one is that it was written pre-70 AD, although I think there's a lot to say for that position. And I think you can read it with reference to the destruction of the temple. That would be kind of a partial preterist view of Revelation. Probably the more prominent view of Revelation is that it was written later, maybe during the time of Domitian, maybe even that John was exiled during Domitian's reign,
Right.
because this was a common thing that was done towards the end of the first century. Of course, it fits with John living much longer. You know, there's a lot of reasons that you can go back and recap in that episode as to why people think it's either early or late. But one of the things that does show up in the book of Revelation is this temptation for emperor worship and kind of the economic complicity of worshiping the emperor. So one of the things you see in the letters to the seven churches is the pressure that they are under of persecution. Some of them are currently, some of them are getting ready to be, and these are the churches in Asia. These are the churches in Turkey. And one of the things that Jesus tells these churches is that he will protect them, that they, even if they shed their blood, even if they die, the ones who conquer will get all these rewards. And in this list, if you go down these seven churches, several of these are not just related to what we would consider religious persecution or social ostracism. This is like guild membership. So when you come into the guild of whatever trade you work in, you have to sprinkle a little bit of incense on the altar, and you do that to essentially worship the emperor and the Roman gods. The problem is not, hey guys, I actually worship at the temple, so I'm not going to do that. The problem is you can no longer have guild approval to practice your craft unless you participate in these meetings, which happen to have a religious component that you can't do. And so sometimes I think the way we think about it, we have a very compartmentalized religious, economic, social framework for our lives. Theirs was very much connected in one little ball of your cultural, political, social, religious life. If you didn't toe the line in worshiping the emperor, it's not just that you were of a different faith. You couldn't do anything. You couldn't be a part of society anymore. And during the reign of Domitian, this really comes to a head. It's not just that Christians were being killed, it's that they were being exiled from society.
Right. You couldn't get a job, couldn't support your family. Then as persecution began, it was not death at first, it was confiscation of your house, your car, your bank accounts. And sometimes we think the ultimate sacrifice for Christians was to give up their life, and there's no doubt that's true. But I think we underestimate how difficult it would be as a Christian to maintain your faith when you were literally no longer going to be able to support your family.
Yeah, this is something I think we see in First Peter, this kind of persecution where it's like it's one thing to die for Christ. Are you willing to live for Christ when it gets very
Right.
difficult? And this was definitely the situation that many Christians found themselves in, particularly people that were of middle, upper class, suited to the culture that they lived in. They become a Christian, your whole life has to change. And all of a sudden you're a person on the margins. What else is happening in the Christian world at this point is you see the rise of the first great round of Christian apologists and debaters.
Right.
You're going to see people like Justin Martyr, later on Tertullian, who are going to be arguing about the doctrine of the faith. And what you see very early on, sometimes we have this sense, kind of the cultural history of Christianity is, oh, they didn't even decide what was in the Bible until later. They didn't come up with the Trinity until the fourth century, all this kind of stuff. Well, actually, this was borne out in these discussions and treatises and
Hmm.
essays that are written in the early second century. People are starting to put language around and define Christian doctrine as we know it from the scriptures, from the teaching of the apostles. We know that during this time, gospels are circulating, letters of Paul in little collections are circulating. There's evidence that, in response to people who are saying, oh, this shouldn't be scripture, people are saying, oh, let's start to define what scripture really is. We thought we kind of agreed on this, but now we've got this aberrant teaching, so we've got to do this. And you have a whole host of churches and centers of Christian life starting to work out the finer points of our doctrine, trying to differentiate between different systems of philosophy, trying to codify for people what it is that Christians really believe. The first catechisms and the first creeds kind of start to make their way around the Christian world during this time.
Hmm.
And so it's just an interesting dichotomy from the book of Acts all the way up through early Christian history. It is this persecution that keeps scattering people. It is opposition that keeps strengthening the church. It is false doctrine that keeps people talking about what true doctrine is. And slowly, as it goes through the years, the Christian church is not only growing in numbers, it's growing in strength.
And that's amazing against the backdrop that we were just talking about. Beginning the second century, you have Domitian and you have economic and physical punishment of Christians. Trajan, circa 117, 120. While he's not hunting down Christians, if you're a Christian and you won't sacrifice, well, we're going to kill you because you're not a good citizen. Marcus Aurelius, a very enlightened emperor, nevertheless, felt the same way. We'll kill the Christians if they won't toe the line. That's circa 160. So as you move through, what's interesting to me, Cole, is as you talk about the church beginning to grow and thrive and talk about its doctrine, it's amazing the church is even there, let alone thriving
Mm-hmm.
under the very nose of the Romans, who are perfectly willing to kill you or confiscate your property, and yet they cannot seem to stamp out the church. In fact, as you said, the church continues to grow and move forward and hone its beliefs in the midst of a hostile environment.
Yeah, you get a second golden age of the Roman Empire around the time of Marcus Aurelius, and afterwards you have a family called the Antonines. Antoninus Pius is one of the emperors that gives his name to this group. This is where Edward Gibbon begins his famous decline and fall of the Roman Empire, is in this
Right.
golden age of Rome. And this is where you have peace in the empire. You have very high quality living for Roman citizens. You have
Mm-hmm.
a lot of technological advances in the empire and relative peace in the world as it's known. Of
Right.
course, what Gibbon's going to argue, and I think what history shows, is this is kind of the beginning of the end of the Roman
Mm-hmm.
Empire. It takes, 1,000 years. for it to fall, but it is a fall and it is a decline. What's interesting is Gibbon famously argues that it's Christians that bring down the empire. That it's their inability to toe the line, as you've said. It's their inability to keep up public morality, their duty to the empire, and that their kind of self-deprecating religion is the thing that hollows out the Roman Empire from the inside. What do you think about Gibbon's argument there?
Yeah, I don't think much of Gibbon's argument, and I don't know that Gibbon's argument is widely accepted today. I think the thinking has moved on past that. But I do understand what he's saying. He's saying if you just look at it from a purely secular point of view, we want people who are sold out for the empire, ready to go kill other people for the empire. And here are all these Christians who are going a completely different direction. You know what it really emphasizes to me, Cole? It emphasizes the idea that politics, the political end of the Rome, the politics is downstream from culture. We've said that many times, is that the politics and the political turmoil that are happening really can find its roots earlier in cultural turmoil or cultural decay. Gibbon looks at Christianity as part of Rome's cultural decay. And I agree from that point of view. They're not good Romans. You know, their ethos is not, let's kill everybody else, take their stuff, and become a great empire. No, it's not. So from that point of view, I understand what Gibbon is saying, is that the Christian culture, the Christian ethos, because it is so successful, has undermined the culture of Rome.
And that is true to an extent because the culture of Rome is going to turn into Christianity. And so
Right.
it's funny, Gibbon's insight is interesting for a lot of reasons, one of which he's just such a fabulous writer. But secondly, because he's sitting in the Christianized West that is the
Right.
product of the decline and fall that he's lamenting. Um, and there's a lot of different reasons for that, but he is essentially lamenting that Roman culture does in some way become superseded by Christian culture.
Right.
And the reason for that is really an intriguing question. I know we've mentioned Rodney Stark's book, The Rise of Christianity, on the podcast before. It's such a great
Mm-hmm.
resource on how the church grew in the early centuries. Essentially, Rodney Stark sets out to explain sociologically how the church grew, and it's through conversion.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity is a converting religion. You're not born into it. You don't practice your way into it. You convert individually. And the reason that people were converting is because Christianity had more to offer in their given situation than whatever it is they believed before. So whether that was a plague, there's tons and tons of plagues in the Roman Empire in the first couple of
Right.
centuries of the church. The Christians are able to handle plagues differently than other Romans. They have more reason to hope. They're caring for people. They're staying when others are fleeing. They're bringing sick people in and taking care of them. Their survival rate is higher. They're preventing infanticide. Christians are known very early on as taking in babies who are left to exposure. And so raise them up. A lot of those babies become Christians because they
Right.
see the what
Yeah.
would
Who
lead you to
who
do something
loved you?
like that.
The Roman society literally threw you on the trash pile to die, but these people believe in the dignity of human life. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
it's an obvious on an individual case by case basis. It's obvious to see why a lot of these people became Christians. And Stark's argument essentially is, well, if you just, compound that rate of interest over 350
mm-hmm.
years, it turns out that by about, the reign of Constantine in the early fourth century, about half the empire is Christian. They've converted.
Right.
And I want to just correct our impression sometimes that there was a mass flip of, well, Christianity just became the thing to do. And so, people became nominally Christians. That may have happened at some point after that. But the lead up to Constantine was that these little churches in these little pockets of the world lived with their Christian witness. They lived like it was worth living and dying for Christ. They modeled a different kind of morality. And all of that with the added benefit of the fact that it's really true that somebody did rise from the dead and lives and reigns and his spirit is here. People
Mm-hmm.
started becoming Christians. Influential people started becoming Christians. Poor people started becoming Christians. It really infiltrated every corner of the Roman world.
That's true because I have heard that statement that it just became the respectable thing to do to become Christian, and I completely reject that. The 10 years before Constantine issues his Edict of Toleration were some of the worst persecution of Christians in all of history. So it's not like it just sort of slowly dissipated, but from 300 to 310, right around there, that was some of the most brutal persecution. So I don't think it was a social thing. It was a new fad, like it's cool to be Christian. It was never cool to be Christian. It just ended up, there were different reasons why Christianity triumphed. You and I would say it's because of the truth of Christianity, and it's because of the power of the Holy Spirit. And it eventually shows the bankruptcy of the ideology of Rome. And I would argue that's still happening now, is that Christianity is always an eyewitness to the bankruptcy of the ideology of the world.
That's right. And certainly there was a lot that people were able to observe in the Roman culture that Christianity stood in opposition to. There was also the opportunity, like we see today, of certain things that the Romans did long for that were true that only Christianity can provide. So if you think of
Right.
the great writings of the Roman Empire, a lot of them seem very close to Christianity. So for example, if you pick up Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, it almost
Mm-hmm.
sounds like it could be Christian. It's at least very morally similar to Christianity. And yet there's no theology behind it. There's no guarantee. There's no what we would call metaphysic, where you can understand how all of this is guaranteed. These sound like good ideas, but so what? Christians were able to come along and say, well, we can actually fill in the details for you.
Right.
Things like justice, things like courage, things like love that the Romans actually did value and aspire to, found their complete fulfillment in the Christian faith. And so, on the philosophical front, you have Christians doing great work of distinguishing, kind of borrowing, thinking about, are these things compatible? Are they not? And a really rich theology begins to develop in the early Roman Empire. You get the early bishops. Of course, you have kind of the papacy, Bishop of Rome, starting to develop. You have some coalition around certain rulers and religious leaders. And the big one is Constantine. So if we go from
Right.
Marcus Aurelius, we think about 120 years later, you get to Constantine, who is certainly worth his own series that maybe we'll get to at some point. But the short story on Constantine is he's fighting, he sees a vision of the cross, he vows to fight for Christ and become a Christian. He is a Christian convert. People have all kinds of opinions over how personal that faith was. But he does something really interesting that we're familiar with today, whether we know it was Constantine or not. He calls a council, the council that we now know as the Council of Nicaea, shortly before, about 12 years before he dies. And it is a council to try to get a consensus among Christians about what it is that they truly believe, something that all Christians can kind of standardize and believe in. And one of the things that comes from that is something that's said in churches every Sunday, even today, which is the Nicene Creed.
Exactly. And this may not be where you're going with this, but I have to talk about the irony of this turning point. So I'm going to use these words. Constantine tried to institutionalize Christianity, and it had never been institutionalized before because it was illegal. It was it was unpleasant, it was unprofitable, and it was not the thing to do to be a Christian. Well, now that the emperor is a Christian, he's going to standardize and institutionalize Christianity, and Christianity becomes comfortable through all the way up till the fall of the Western Roman Empire and through the Byzantine Empire up until the Ottoman Turks. But basically, uh, I'm going to suggest that uh, the the worst thing that happened to the church was it became comfortable and affluent. I mean, for the people, well, certainly that's better than being having your head chopped off or being killed. But the health of the church was better when it was persecuted than when it was institutionalized and when comfort came to the church. I just think that's a bit ironic. Is the good times of the church were the hard time, what we would consider the hard times.
And the hard times produced a lot of the growth. It's a great reminder for us of the path that Christianity has taken. I think to reflect a little bit on the path that Christianity took in the Roman Empire and certainly the end of the Roman Empire, the fall of the Roman Empire, Christianity in some ways becomes uh, intertwined with the Roman Empire in a
Hmm.
way that now you think of the Holy Roman Empire up until even World War One, it
Right.
was a Christian empire.
Right.
You have the Vatican, which is in the heart of Rome, the power center of the Roman Empire. You think of Italy, you think of the influence of Christianity. You think of the West, you think of the influence of Christianity. At some point, Christianity and Rome became almost indistinguishable.
Hmm.
And just the story of how that happened, if you go all the way back to our prophecies in Daniel, that you've got these empires coming and going, this one empire that's going to
Right.
rise up, that's going to be more powerful than all the others. And at that time, Daniel 7 says there's going to be the Son of Man who takes the kingdom from the Ancient of Days and he rules forever and ever and ever. Not at all to say that his kingdom is coextensive with Rome, but just
Right.
to say that Israel had been conquered by all these empires. And Daniel's vision shows that there is a true greater empire to come that could crush all of those empires. And that's the one that's going to be superseded by Christianity. That's the one where God's going to send his son in the midst of that rule, right under their noses. And he's going to be the one who reigns forever and ever. And sure enough, Rome was uprooted from the inside. And now, if you think about Rome, you think of Christ, you think of Christianity.
The irony of this, kind of the bookending of this era, is we started this with the reign of Tiberius and the cross in, let's call it 33 AD, the traditional date for it. But in the reign of Tiberius, you see the cross and you see the power of Rome appears to have defeated uh, Christianity. It appears to have crucified the King of the Jews and the Son of God. And fast forward 250 years later to Constantine, and that story is completely turned around.
Yeah, I heard a pastor say one time, there's a reason now that we name our dogs Nero and Caesar and our kids Peter and Paul. And what a reversal that is. I think the instruments of death are the greatest sign of the reversal. So the cross was a scandal in the first century. And it was even up through the first centuries of the church. It wasn't even until 400 years after Christ that you saw the cross being routinely depicted in art just
Hmm.
because it was so grotesque. And
Right.
now we
It
wear it
was
around our necks
yeah.
like it's a symbol of hope, which it is. But just what a reversal. Even the early Christians had a hard time really portraying the cross because it was so brutal and graphic. I think the biggest symbol, though, of this reversal is the Colosseum. Of course, the Colosseum was a place where Christians were killed. We think of gladiators fighting
Hmm.
Christians, though, being devoured by beasts, being um, killed in front of audiences, thirsting for blood. And what's interesting now is starting in 1675, actually, Pope Clement X erected a giant cross in the center of the arena. And it's moved around. And in 2000, Pope John Paul II put a cross there to commemorate all those Christians who died in the Roman arena. But if you go there today, one of the interesting things is the Colosseum sits in ruins. And it's kind of eerie because it's surrounded by modern buildings.
Hmm.
And the world has passed Rome by. The world has moved on, and the Colosseum, the might of Rome, sits there in ruins. And if you look in through the arches of the Roman Colosseum now, you can see a cross. And what was the sign of torture and the sign of Rome, which proclaimed itself the eternal empire, now what truly remains is billions of Christians in church history and the triumph of the cross, the triumph of the humble and embarrassing death of a slave who is now the Lord of all, and the deified God emperors that we could barely remember their names. And that's the essence of the story arc of Christianity is humiliation and exaltation. And following the pattern of Christ, he was humiliated. He went as low as you could possibly go and has been raised as high as he can go. And that's really the story of the church in ways too. The church has been persecuted. They've tried to stamp it out. They've tried to kill Christians. And yet there are more and more and more and more Christians still here. And all the empires that have tried to snuff out the church have gone and will go between now and the time that Christ reigns eternally in his heavenly kingdom.
It reminds me of the Apostle Paul in the middle of persecution in 2 Corinthians 12, that famous passage where he asked God to remove some of his difficulties, and God said, "My grace is enough for you. My power is made perfect or completed in your weakness." And Paul, in typical Paul fashion, says, "Well, in that case, I will boast all the more about my weakness, for when I am weak, then I am strong."